The 18-wheeler's horn shattered the morning quiet as Matthew Garrison swerved his old Chevy Silverado onto the shoulder of Interstate 40, somewhere between Amarillo and Oklahoma City. His heart hammered against his ribs as he watched the massive truck barrel past, missing them by inches. 8-year-old Samuel sat frozen in the back seat, his baseball glove still clutched in his small hands. "You okay, buddy?" Matthew asked, checking the rearview mirror. "Yeah, Dad. That was close. Too close." Matthew's hands trembled slightly as he merged back onto the highway. 3 years since Rebecca died, and he still found himself looking over at the empty passenger seat, expecting to see her smile, hear her laugh at his terrible jokes. Some mornings, he still made coffee for two before remembering. They were heading home from Samuel's Little League practice when Matthew spotted them at the rest stop near Weatherford. A woman in a wheelchair sat beneath the covered picnic area, rain beginning to fall in thick sheets. Two girls, maybe 7 or 8 years old, identical down to their worn sneakers, stood on either side of her chair like tiny sentinels. One held a black garbage bag over their mother's head, trying to keep her dry. The other was attempting to push the wheelchair toward the restroom building, but the wheels kept getting stuck in the gravel. Matthew pulled into the parking lot, telling himself he was just stopping to wait out the storm. But watching those girls struggle, watching that mother try to smile and encourage them despite their obvious distress, something shifted in his chest. It was the same feeling he'd had when he'd first seen Rebecca at that church potluck 15 years ago, like God was tapping him on the shoulder saying, "Pay attention, this matters." "Dad, why are we stopping?" Samuel asked. "Just need to check something," Matthew said, grabbing his jacket from behind the seat. He jogged through the rain to the covered area. Up close, he could see the woman's wheelchair was old, one wheel slightly bent. The girls' clothes were clean but threadbare. They had the same striking green eyes, the same determined set to their jaws. "Excuse me, ma'am," Matthew said, trying not to startle them. "Y'all need some help?" The woman looked up at him with a mixture of pride and exhaustion. "We're managing, thank you. Just waiting for the rain to pass." One of the girls, the one holding the garbage bag, spoke up. "The bus driver said this wasn't a real stop. He made us get off." "Sophia," the mother said quietly, a warning in her tone. "But it's true, Mama," the other girl said. "He said we were slowing everyone down." Matthew felt anger flare in his chest. "He left you here, in a storm?" The woman's name was Ruth Morrison, 34 years old, though the lines around her eyes suggested she'd lived more years than that. A car accident 5 years ago had taken her ability to walk, and shortly after, her husband Christopher had decided a wife in a wheelchair and twin daughters were more than he'd signed up for. He'd left them with nothing but divorce papers and a forwarding address in Canada. Ruth had been trying to get to her cousin's place in Arkansas, the only family she had left. They'd scraped together bus fare, but the driver had grown impatient with how long it took to load and unload the wheelchair at each stop. When Ruth had asked him to wait while she got the girls to the restroom at this rest stop, he'd told her she was holding up 40 other passengers and drove off without them. "I've called my cousin," Ruth said, rain still drumming on the metal roof above them. "She can't come get us until Thursday. We'll be fine here until then." Thursday. It was Monday. "You're planning to stay at a rest stop for 3 days?" Matthew couldn't hide his disbelief. "We've managed worse," Ruth said, and something in her eyes told him she wasn't exaggerating. The girl named Sophia was trying to open a can of Vienna sausages with a broken can opener. Her twin, who Matthew learned was named Isabella, was carefully rationing crackers from a nearly empty box. Samuel had gotten out of the truck and stood nearby, watching with wide eyes. "No," Matthew heard himself say. "No, this isn't right. I've got a house 20 minutes from here. Y'all are coming with us." Ruth shook her head immediately. "We couldn't impose. We don't even know you. Name's Matthew Garrison. This is my son Samuel. I work at Brennan's Auto Shop in Yukon. Been there 12 years. I'm a deacon at First Baptist Church on Maple Street. My wife Rebecca passed 3 years ago from cancer, and I know what it's like to have the world flip upside down on you. Now, We can stand here in the rain debating, or we can get y'all somewhere warm and dry. Your choice, but I'm not leaving you here." Isabella looked up at her mother. "Mama, I'm cold." That seemed to break something in Ruth. Her shoulders sagged, and she nodded once. "Just for tonight." It took some doing to get the wheelchair into the truck bed, and everyone situated in the cab, but they managed. The girls sat in the back with Samuel, who was already showing them his baseball cards. Ruth sat up front, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I'm not a charity case," she said quietly as they drove. "Never said you were," Matthew replied. "Sometimes folks just need a hand. Nothing wrong with that." The house wasn't much. A 3-bedroom ranch style that needed new siding and had a kitchen that hadn't been updated since the 80s. But it was warm and dry, and Matthew had built a ramp to the front door back when Rebecca was too weak to manage the steps during chemo. It would work perfectly for Ruth's chair. That first night, Matthew made spaghetti, the one meal he could cook without burning. The girls ate like they hadn't seen food in days, and Samuel chattered non-stop about school and baseball and his collection of Marvel comics. Ruth kept apologizing, kept saying they'd be gone in the morning, but Matthew could see she was fighting just to keep her eyes open. "Guest room's down the hall," he said after dinner. "It's got a queen bed. Girls can share with you, or I can set up the air mattress." "We'll be gone tomorrow," Ruth said again. But tomorrow came, and Isabella woke up with a fever. Then the wheelchair's bent wheel finally gave out completely. Then Thursday arrived, and Ruth's cousin called to say her husband had lost his job and they couldn't take in 3 more people right now. "I'll find somewhere else," Ruth insisted, but she was running out of options and they both knew it. Matthew was fixing the wheelchair in his garage, Samuel and the twins playing in the yard, when Ruth rolled out in the temporary chair he'd borrowed from their church. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Really? What do you want?" Matthew set down his wrench and looked at her. Really looked at her. She was beautiful, he realized, in a way that had nothing to do with conventional prettiness. It was in the fierce way she loved her daughters, the dignity she maintained despite everything life had thrown at her. "My wife used to say that God puts people in our path for a reason," Matthew said. "Maybe you're here to help us as much as we're here to help you. House has been too quiet, Samuel needs other kids around, and maybe I need to remember that helping others is what Rebecca would want me to do." Ruth's eyes filled with tears. "I can't pay you back." "Don't want you to. But if you're staying, you're family, not guests. That means you help with chores, girls help with dishes, you help Samuel with his homework, because Lord knows I'm terrible at 4th grade math. Deal?" She laughed and it transformed her entire face. Deal. The weeks turned into months. Ruth, it turned out, had been a graphic designer before the accident. She started taking freelance work online, contributing what she could to the household. The girls thrived in their new school. Sophia, quiet and bookish, helped Samuel with his reading. Isabella, bold and athletic despite her small size, became his fiercest defender on the playground when older kids tried to bully him. Matthew found himself looking forward to coming home from work, to the noise and chaos of 3 children, to Ruth's smile when he walked through the door. They developed routines. Sunday church, followed by lunch at the diner, Tuesday movie nights, Saturday morning pancakes that the kids helped make, usually resulting in more batter on the counter than in the pan. It was on a Tuesday night, 6 months after that rest stop encounter, that everything changed. They were watching some animated movie the kids had picked when the doorbell rang. Matthew opened it to find a man in an expensive suit standing on his porch, briefcase in hand. "Mr. Matthew Garrison?" the man asked. "Yes? My name is James Whitmore from Whitmore, Krensky and Associates. I'm looking for Ruth Morrison and her daughters." Matthew's protective instincts flared. "What's this about?" "I have information regarding Isabella Morrison's inheritance." Ruth wheeled herself to the door. "Inheritance? There must be some mistake." The lawyer smiled slightly. "No mistake, ma'am. Perhaps we could discuss this inside." The story that unfolded was like something from a movie. Ruth's ex-husband Christopher had a brother named Thomas who'd made a fortune in tech startups. Thomas had never married, never had children, but he'd met the twins once when they were babies, before Christopher had cut ties with his family out of jealousy over his brother's success. Thomas never forgot those girls, Whitmore explained. When he learned about the divorce, about Christopher abandoning you all, he was furious. He tried to find you, but Christopher wouldn't provide any information. Thomas hired private investigators, but you'd moved so many times. Ruth's hand shook. Thomas is dead? Pancreatic cancer 4 months ago. He left everything to Isabella and Sophia, but there was a condition. He knew Isabella was his biological daughter. The room went completely silent. Even the kids, who'd been playing in Samuel's room, seemed to sense something momentous happening. What? Ruth's voice was barely a whisper. Christopher never told you. It wasn't a question. Whitmore's expression was sympathetic. Thomas and Christopher's wife, your ex-husband's first wife, Maria, had a brief relationship before she married Christopher. She was already pregnant when the wedding happened. Christopher knew but agreed to raise the child as his own. After Maria died in childbirth with the twins, Christopher remarried you and never said a word. Ruth looked like she might faint. Matthew moved closer, ready to steady her if needed. Isabella is Thomas's daughter. He left her everything. Roughly $800 million in assets, properties and trust funds. Sophia receives a generous trust fund as well, $50 million. Because Thomas said he couldn't leave one sister with nothing. But there are conditions. Conditions? Matthew asked. The inheritance is held in trust until Isabella turns 21, but Ruth has full control as guardian for their education, housing, and reasonable living expenses. However, Whitmore paused, Thomas was very specific. He didn't want the money to destroy the girls' childhoods. They're to remain in stable housing, continue in public or moderate private schooling, and maintain a middle-class lifestyle until they're old enough to handle the wealth responsibly. He saw too many trust fund kids destroyed by money they didn't earn. Ruth was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. He knew about us. He tried to help. He did more than try, Whitmore said, pulling out more documents. He also left a personal letter for you, Ruth. And one for each of the girls, to be opened on their 18th birthdays. Ruth read her letter privately that night, while Matthew helped the kids with homework, trying to maintain normalcy despite the day's revelations. When she came out of her room, her eyes were swollen from crying. He apologized, she said simply, for Christopher, for not finding us sooner, for Maria, for everything. Over the next weeks, lawyers and financial advisors came and went. Accounts were established, trusts were clarified, and a modest monthly allowance was arranged. Enough to ensure comfort, but not excess. Ruth insisted on paying Matthew rent, which led to their first real argument. We're not your tenants, Matthew said firmly. We're a family. You've done enough, Ruth countered. More than enough. We can get our own place now. The thought of them leaving felt like a punch to the gut. The house would be empty again. Silent. Samuel would lose his sisters, because that's what Sophia and Isabella had become. And Ruth. Matthew realized with startling clarity that he'd fallen in love with her, not dramatically or suddenly, but slowly, like sunrise creeping across the plains. Don't go, he said quietly. Please. Ruth looked at him for a long moment. Give me a reason to stay. Because Samuel needs his sisters. Because the girls need a father figure. Because... Matthew took a breath. Because I love you. All of you. And I think maybe you feel the same. Ruth's response was to wheel herself closer and take his hand. I do, she whispered, but I'm scared. I've been left before, and now with this money... The money doesn't change anything, Matthew said firmly. You're still Ruth. The girls are still Sophia and Isabella. We're still us. They were married 8 months later, in a simple ceremony at First Baptist. Samuel was the ring-bearer. Sophia and Isabella were flower girls, and Ruth wheeled herself down the aisle in a white dress that made her look like an angel. The congregation who'd watched this unlikely family form wept openly. The money, as it turned out, became a tool for good. They established a foundation to help stranded families, particularly those with disabled parents. They bought the auto shop where Matthew worked, making him part owner but keeping him in the garage because that's where he was happiest. They set up college funds not just for their own children, but for 20 kids in their community whose families couldn't afford higher education. But the biggest changes were the small ones. Ruth could afford better medical care and a state-of-the-art wheelchair that gave her more independence. The girls could have dance lessons and art classes. Samuel got the baseball camp he'd dreamed of. They bought a larger house, nothing mansion-like, but big enough that everyone had their own space while still feeling like a family. 3 years later, on a Christmas morning, with snow falling outside their windows, a rarity in Oklahoma, Matthew watched his family around the tree. Ruth was helping their newest addition, 2-year-old Rebecca Grace, open a present. The twins, now 11, were teaching Samuel a complicated card game. The house smelled of cinnamon rolls and coffee, and Matthew could hear more family arriving. Ruth's cousin had moved closer, and Matthew's parents were visiting from Houston. Sophia looked up and caught his eye. "Dad, are you crying?" He was, Matthew realized. "Happy tears, sweetheart." Isabella rolled her eyes in that preteen way. "You're such a softy." "Guilty as charged," Matthew said, scooping up little Rebecca and joining them on the floor. Later that night, after the extended family had gone home and the kids were in bed, Matthew and Ruth sat by the fireplace. She'd transferred from her chair to the couch, curled against his side. "Do you ever think about that day?" she asked. "At the rest stop." "Every day," Matthew admitted. "I almost didn't stop. I was tired. Samuel had homework. I had a dozen reasons to keep driving." "But you didn't." "No," Matthew agreed. "Thank God I didn't." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "The lawyer called yesterday. Isabella's trust is performing better than expected. By the time she turns 21, it could be over $1 billion. Matthew whistled low. "That's a lot of responsibility." "She'll handle it well. Both girls will. They've got good heads on their shoulders." "They've got a good mother," Matthew corrected. "And a good father," Ruth added. "The one they were meant to have." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire, listening to the wind outside. Somewhere upstairs they could hear Samuel and the twins giggling, probably sneaking Christmas cookies they thought their parents didn't know about. "Matthew," Ruth said softly. "Yeah?" "Thomas's letter. He wrote something I never told you. He said he'd been watching us for weeks before he died. Had his investigators tracking us. He saw you take us in. He said..." Here she paused, emotion thickening her voice. "He said he waited to die until he knew we were safe, until he knew the girls had found their real father." Matthew pulled her closer, feeling the weight and wonder of it all. How a moment of kindness could reshape entire lives, how strangers could become family, how God could work through rest stops and broken wheelchairs and storms to bring people exactly where they needed to be. 5 years later, Isabella Morrison Garrison stood at a podium, addressing a crowd of investors and philanthropists. At 16, she'd been granted partial access to her trust for a specific purpose, launching a nationwide network of emergency family shelters specifically designed for families with disabled members. Beside her, Sophia held up the architectural plans they'd drawn together. In the audience, Matthew and Ruth watched with Samuel, Rebecca Grace, and their newest addition, 4-year-old Thomas Matthew, named for the uncle who'd made so much possible. "My family's story started at a rest stop," Isabella said, her voice clear and strong. "We were abandoned, struggling, and alone, but one man's kindness changed everything. He didn't know about the money. He didn't know about inheritances or trusts or any of that. He just saw a family in need and opened his heart and his home. That's what these shelters will do. They'll be rest stops for families in crisis, places where kindness can change everything." The crowd erupted in applause. Matthew felt Ruth's hand squeeze his, and he looked down to see her crying again, Happy tears, always happy tears these days. After the presentation, as they were loading into their van, they'd had to upgrade to accommodate the wheelchair and 5 kids. A reporter approached them. "Mr. Garrison, how does it feel knowing your act of kindness led to all this?" Matthew thought for a moment, then smiled. "My wife Rebecca used to say that we're all just travelers on this road, and sometimes God puts us at the right rest stop at the right time. I'm just grateful I didn't drive past." The reporter turned to Ruth. "And you, Mrs. Garrison? From being abandoned at a rest stop to running a multi-million-dollar foundation, that's quite a journey." Ruth looked at her family. Matthew buckling Thomas into his car seat, Samuel helping Rebecca with her seatbelt, the twins checking something on Sophia's phone, probably the latest donation numbers for their shelter project. "You know," Ruth said, "people focus on the money, the dramatic transformation. But the real miracle, it's Sunday mornings when we can't find anyone's shoes. It's Matthew teaching Samuel to shave while the girls laugh at them both. It's bedtime prayers and birthday cakes and ordinary Tuesday dinners where everyone talks over each other. The money just lets us share that miracle with others." "One more question," the reporter said. "The shelters will cost hundreds of millions to build and maintain. Why not just keep the money for your family?" This time, Isabella answered, "Because families aren't just about blood or adoption papers or even love. They're about choosing each other again and again, especially when it's hard. Our dad, Matthew, chose us when we had nothing to offer but need. These shelters will give other families that same chance to choose each other." As they drove home, the van full of chatter and laughter, Matthew caught Ruth's eye in the rearview mirror. She was smiling that smile that still made his heart skip, even after all these years. "What?" he asked. "Just thinking about that rest stop," she said. "How you argued with me about coming with you." "You were stubborn," Matthew laughed. "I was scared," Ruth corrected. "Scared to hope." "And now?" She looked around the van, at their beautiful, chaotic, perfect family. "Now, I'm not scared of anything. Well, except maybe Isabella's driving lessons next year." "Hey!" Isabella protested. "I'll be an excellent driver." "That's what I'm afraid of," Matthew muttered, and the whole van dissolved into laughter. That night, after everyone was asleep, Matthew stood in the doorway of each child's room, a habit he'd developed when Samuel was little and never broken. The twins, almost 17 now, still shared a room by choice, their beds perpendicular so they could whisper across the gap. Samuel, 14 and gangly, had his baseball trophies lined up on his dresser. Rebecca Grace, 5 and fierce, slept with approximately 30 stuffed animals, and little Thomas curled up in his toddler bed, thumb in his mouth despite Ruth's efforts to break the habit. Finally, Matthew made his way to his own room where Ruth was reading, her glasses perched on her nose. She looked up as he entered. "Everyone asleep?" "Yeah," Matthew said, climbing into bed beside her. "You know what I was thinking?" "What's that?" "That preacher at the revival last week, talking about how God's plans are bigger than our understanding. I used to think that was just church talk, you know. But then I think about us. About how Christopher leaving you led you to that rest stop, how Thomas dying led to the inheritance, how Rebecca dying led me to be there at just the right moment. It's like," he struggled for the words, "like God was writing a story," Ruth finished. "And we were all characters who didn't know our parts yet." "Exactly," Matthew pulled her close, "though I've got to say, if God's a writer, he's got a flair for the dramatic." Ruth laughed. "Billionaire inheritance, long-lost uncles, rest stop rescues. It does sound like something from a movie." "The best kind," Matthew agreed, "the kind where everyone gets a happy ending." "Not an ending," Ruth corrected, "a beginning. Every day with you feels like a new beginning." Outside, snow began to fall again, unusual for Oklahoma, but not impossible. Matthew thought about miracles, about the difference between the impossible and the improbable. Their story was improbable, certainly, but impossible, no, because with faith, With love, with the courage to stop at rest stops and open your heart to strangers, anything was possible. 10 years from that night at the rest stop, the Morrison Garrison Family Foundation had opened 37 shelters across the country. Each one had a plaque by the entrance with the same inscription: "Sometimes angels come disguised as strangers at rest stops." Sometimes miracles begin with someone simply saying, "Y'all need some help?" Isabella, now 21 and in full control of her inheritance, had grown it to nearly $2 billion through careful investments, every penny earmarked for helping families in crisis. Sophia, with her own trust fund, had become a doctor specializing in spinal cord injuries, inspired by her mother's journey. Samuel was in his senior year of college, studying to become a teacher and coach, wanting to give kids the same support and love he'd received. Rebecca Grace, at 12, had started a YouTube channel about growing up in a blended family that had somehow gained 3 million subscribers. And little Thomas, 7 now, and no longer so little, had announced he wanted to be a preacher like the one who married Mommy and Daddy. Matthew still worked at the auto shop 3 days a week, not because they needed the money, but because he loved the work, the honest simplicity of fixing what was broken. Ruth had become a sought-after speaker, traveling to churches and conferences to tell their story, always in her wheelchair, always radiant. But the best moments were still the quiet ones. Sunday dinners with too many people crowded around the table, Christmas mornings with wrapping paper everywhere, random Tuesday nights when one of the kids would call from college just to say hello, the sound of Ruth laughing at his terrible dad jokes, the weight of Thomas falling asleep on his shoulder during church, the sight of the twins, home from medical school and MIT respectively, still finishing each other's sentences. "Do you have any regrets?" a documentary filmmaker had asked Matthew, working on a piece about the foundation. Matthew had thought about it for a long moment. "Just one," he'd finally said. "I regret every car I passed before that rest stop, every person I could have helped but didn't, because I was too busy, too tired, too focused on my own problems. That rest stop taught me that we're all one moment of kindness away from changing someone's life or having our own changed." The filmmaker had turned to Ruth. "What about you? Any regrets?" Ruth had smiled that smile that still took Matthew's breath away. "How can you regret the path that led you home? Every hard thing, every painful moment, every tear, they all led me to that rest stop. They all led me to Matthew. They all led us to becoming who we were meant to be." Later, as Matthew edited the interview transcript, the filmmaker had asked him to review it for accuracy. He added one more thought. "People ask me if I'm a hero for taking in Ruth and the girls. I'm not. Heroes do extraordinary things. I just did what any decent person should do. I saw a need and I tried to fill it. The fact that it led to all this, the money, the foundation, the shelters, that's not heroism. That's grace. That's God taking our small acts of kindness and multiplying them like loaves and fishes. I'm not a hero. I'm just a man who stopped at a rest stop and found his family." But perhaps the most powerful moment came years later, when Rebecca Grace, now 21 herself, stood at her wedding, raising a toast. "My dad likes to say he's not a hero, but I disagree. See, heroes aren't people who seek glory or recognition. Heroes are people who do the right thing when no one's watching, who open their doors to strangers, who choose love over fear every single time. My dad stopped at a rest stop 13 years ago and saved not just my mum and sisters, but me and Thomas too, because we wouldn't exist without that moment of kindness. So here's to heroes disguised as ordinary people, to rest stops that become turning points, and to the beautiful truth that family isn't about blood, it's about choosing each other, again and again, no matter what." The crowd at the wedding, a mix of shelter residents they'd helped over the years, family both biological and chosen, and friends from every chapter of their journey, erupted in applause. Matthew felt Ruth's hand in his, steady and sure, the weight of their wedding rings a constant reminder of promises kept. "You know what I think?" Ruth whispered as their daughter danced with her new husband. "What's that?" "I think Rebecca would be proud. Your first Rebecca. I think she'd be happy you didn't let her death make you bitter, that you kept your heart open." Matthew blinked back tears. Even after all these years, Ruth's grace in honoring his first wife's memory still moved him. "She would have loved you," he said. "She would have loved all of this." "She does," Ruth said simply. "Through you, through the love you show us every day. Her kindness lives on in you and now in our children." As the music played and their family danced, the twins with their husbands, Samuel with his fiancée, Thomas showing off his teenage dance moves, and Rebecca Grace radiant in her wedding dress, Matthew marveled at the journey, from a rest stop in the rain to this moment of perfect joy. "Hey," Ruth said, tugging his hand, "dance with me." "Your chair has never stopped us before," she grinned. And so they danced, Matthew standing, Ruth rolling, moving together to the music with the practiced ease of people who'd learned to navigate every obstacle together. The photographer captured the moment, the widowed mechanic and the abandoned mother, the billionaire's heirs and the boy who'd shared his home, all of them spinning and laughing under string lights and stars. Later, someone would post that photo online with their story, and it would go viral, shared millions of times with captions about faith and love and the power of kindness. But in that moment, they were just a family, dancing at a wedding, celebrating the extraordinary life that had grown from one ordinary act of compassion at a rest stop in the rain. The next morning, as Matthew and Ruth sat on their porch, watching the sun rise over the Oklahoma plains, Ruth asked a question she'd never asked before. "Do you think it was really just chance, that you stopped at that exact rest stop at that exact moment?" Matthew considered it, sipping his coffee. He still made 2 cups every morning, one for him and one for Ruth, though now it was a choice rather than a forgotten habit. "No," he said finally. "I think God had a plan. I think he knew Thomas was dying, knew you needed help, knew I needed purpose. I think he orchestrated the whole thing. Even Christopher leaving us? Especially that. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us are just God clearing the path for something better." Ruth nodded slowly. "I used to be so angry at Christopher, at God, at the whole world. But now I'm grateful for every single thing that led me to you." They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes from years of partnership, of facing storms together and coming out stronger. In the distance, they could hear Thomas and Samuel arguing about something, probably video games, and Rebecca Grace's laughter floating from her old room where she and her new husband were staying before their honeymoon. "Matthew," Ruth said softly. "Yeah? If you could go back knowing everything, would you still stop?" Matthew looked at her, this woman who'd become his best friend, his partner, his love. He thought of the twins who called him Dad, of Samuel, who'd become the best big brother anyone could ask for, of Rebecca Grace and Thomas, who wouldn't exist without that moment of decision. "I'd stop sooner," he said. "I'd run through that rain faster. I'd argue less about you coming home with us. Because every second of doubt was a second wasted when I could have been starting our life together." Ruth laughed, that bright, beautiful sound that still made his heart race. "You know what? For a mechanic, you're pretty good with words." "Only when I'm talking about you," Matthew said, taking her hand. As the sun climbed higher, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, they could hear their family waking up, starting another day. There would be breakfast to make, foundation business to handle, probably a few minor crises and major joys. But for now, in this moment, Matthew and Ruth sat together on their porch, proof that sometimes the greatest love stories begin not with grand gestures, but with simple kindness, not with perfection, but with broken people choosing to heal together. And somewhere, at rest stops across the country, their shelters stood ready, waiting for the next family in crisis, the next opportunity for strangers to become angels, the next chance for kindness to change everything. Because that's what the Morrison-Garrison family had learned. We're all just travelers on this road, and sometimes the most important journey isn't to where we're going, but to who we become along the way. The story could end there, with sunrise and coffee and contentment. But life doesn't really end, it just keeps flowing, like a river that sometimes runs smooth and sometimes rapids, but always moves forward. 2 years after Rebecca Grace's wedding, Matthew got the call that would test everything they'd built. Thomas, now 17 and preparing for college, had been in a car accident. He was alive but badly hurt, and the doctors weren't sure if he'd walk again. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Ruth, who'd spent years in a wheelchair, now watched her youngest son face the same possibility. But where once there might have been despair, now there was only determination. "We've done this before," Ruth told Thomas as he lay in the hospital bed. "If you can't walk, we'll teach you to roll. If you can't run, we'll teach you to fly in different ways. And if you can walk again, we'll be there for every step." The family rallied. Isabella flew in from her foundation headquarters in New York. Sophia took leave from her practice. Samuel brought his whole family, his teacher's patience perfect for the long recovery ahead. Rebecca Grace, pregnant with her second child, video called daily from California, where her husband was stationed with the Navy. And Matthew did what he'd always done. He built ramps, modified vehicles, and refused to let anyone give up hope. He sat by Thomas's bed during the long nights, telling stories about the rest stop, about choosing family, about how the broken places are where light gets in. 6 months later, Thomas took his first steps, halting, painful, supported by parallel bars and determination, but steps nonetheless. The whole family was there, cheering and crying, and Matthew couldn't help but think of that first night at the rest stop, how he'd carried the twins' bags while Ruth wheeled herself up his newly built ramp. "You know what this means?" Thomas said, grinning through the pain. "What's that, buddy?" Matthew asked. "I've got the best college essay topic ever. How my family's rest stop story came full circle." Everyone laughed, but it was true. The boy who'd been born because a rest stop brought his parents together had faced his own crossroads and chosen, like his parents before him, to keep moving forward. Thomas did write that essay. It got him into Harvard, though he chose Oklahoma State instead, wanting to stay close to home. He became a lawyer, specializing in disability rights, eventually arguing a case before the Supreme Court that established precedent for accessibility requirements in public transportation. But that was all still to come. In that moment, in that rehab facility, surrounded by his family, Thomas was just a teenager learning to walk again, supported by parents who'd learned long ago that the strongest families are the ones that choose each other, especially when the choosing is hard. "Hey, Dad," Thomas said after his physical therapy session, Matthew helping him back into bed. "Yeah? Do you really think God planned all this? The rest stop, Mom? The money, even my accident?" Matthew considered his son, this miracle child born from a love that shouldn't have been possible. "I think God gives us opportunities to choose love over fear, kindness over indifference. The rest stop was a choice. Taking your mom in was a choice. Every day we wake up and choose to be a family is a choice. Maybe God plans the opportunities, but we make the choices. And my accident? Another opportunity. To choose hope over despair. To choose fighting over giving up. To choose to let this make you stronger rather than bitter." Thomas nodded slowly. "I choose to fight." "I know you do," Matthew said, ruffling his son's hair like he was still 7 instead of 17. "You're a Morrison Garrison. We don't know how to quit." That night, as the family gathered for dinner in the rehab facility's family room, they'd essentially moved in, rotating shifts. Ruth raised her glass of apple juice. "To rest stops," she said. Everyone looked confused except Matthew, who smiled and raised his own glass. "To rest stops," he agreed. "The ones on highways and the ones in life. The places where we stop running and start becoming who we're meant to be." "To rest stops," the whole family chorused, even Thomas from his wheelchair, temporary though it would prove to be. And in that moment, in that sterile rehab facility that had become another unexpected home, the Morrison Garrison family was complete. Not perfect, perfection was never the goal, but complete in their imperfection, whole in their brokenness, and absolutely certain that no matter what rest stops lay ahead, they'd face them together. Because that's what family does. They stop for each other, they carry each other, they choose each other again and again, until the choosing becomes as natural as breathing, as essential as heartbeat, as eternal as the love that brought them together in the first place. And somewhere, Matthew was certain, Rebecca was watching and smiling, knowing that her husband had kept his heart open, that her death had led not to ending but to beginning, that love, real love, rest, stop love, choosing love, never really dies. It just transforms, like strangers into family, like rest stops into destiny, like ordinary Tuesday rainstorms into the first chapter of an extraordinary life.